Hi, this is Bob Minner, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass.
My guest on Bluegrass Jam Along today is Bob Minner. A lot of you will know Bob as Tim McGraw's guitarist, which he's been for almost 30 years now. A lot of you will know Bob from the front porch videos he posts on YouTube. Beautiful acoustic guitar playing, loads of great tunes and songs on there. Check them out if you haven't seen them. I know Bob initially because he's the admin of a Facebook guitar group, Bluegrass guitar group, that I joined a year or so ago. Just got to sort of know Bob's playing and know Bob through that. So whichever way you know Bob, Bob's here with us today to talk about a really special project, and it is a tribute to Norman Blake. The record's called From Sulphur Springs to Rising Fawn, the songs of Norman Blake, and contains a load of great pickers, a load of great tunes, and there's a lot of great chat to be had about how this came about, I think. So, Bob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, Matt.
It's really cool. It's such a great thing, and I'd love to just sort of kick off with how it came about, really. So, sure. Why Norman and why now?
Well, when I was 12 years old, I don't remember how I got the money, but I had enough money to buy a cheap Bentley guitar, acoustic guitar, and I bought my first Norman Blake album, which was the Whiskey Before Breakfast album. And I guess the reason that kind of resonated with me is because the original album had a sticker on it that said Norman Blake's guitar album. You know, but prior to that, my dad was already involved with, he had a bunch of vinyl in the house of course, Will the Circle Be Unbroken album, a bunch of string band, claw hammer, banjo kind of music. So that was already in the house, you know. So anyway, and he took me to see Doc Watson when I was like 5 or 6, but I don't really kind of recall a whole lot about that, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, I bought this album and this guitar, and that kind of started the whole journey with the whole Norman Blake thing. So, through the years, Norman's guitar playing, songwriting, of course, everything, and Nancy as well, you know, that whole package, it just kind of followed me through my whole life, you know. And of course, we moved to Nashville, and I've been with Tim playing acoustic for him for 30 years this year, which is That's a long time to have a job anywhere, I guess, much less in the music business. And George Gruhn lives up here by me. We're neighbors. And I was at his shop, in fact, February of last year, and just talking. He's showing me some of the great new stuff they've got in, stuff I'll never be able to afford, you know. So one thing led to another. And I was talking to him, and I said, you know, I want to do a solo project, just various tunes, maybe some fiddle tunes, maybe some songs that I've written lyrically. I said, there's a Norman Blake song that I've always wanted to redo called Lonesome Jenny. I said, it has a huge cello part that Nancy plays on it. I said, well, I don't know any cello players. I'm sure they're in Nashville, but they're kind of maybe, you know, hard to come by. So George, in his usual way, says, well, why don't we just call Norman and Nancy? And he pulls out a cell phone. And in a matter of seconds, there's Norman and Nancy on speakerphone. And I'm just totally freaked out because there's the voice.
And had you met them before? Or...
Oh, no, never. And it's kind of funny. I had someone give me Norman's P.O. box in Rising Fawn. And I thought about writing a letter, and I'm like, he's not going to answer. You know, he's Norman Blake. Who am I? So I never contacted him, never met him, just a huge fan. So anyway, I after that phone call with Norman and Nancy at George's shop, I just kind of kept in contact. And then Kenny Smith and Kenny lives right up the road from me in Lebanon, Missouri. Tennessee, rather. Me and Kenny called Norman on his birthday last year because Kenny's a huge Norman Blake fan as well. And so I just kind of kept in contact. And it was probably towards the end of March or sometime in April that I told my wife, I said, you know, as much as I'd like to do another project for myself, with Tony Rice passing in December before, which left a huge void. And I expected kind of a plethora of Tony Rice tribute albums to come out. So, it's the old joke. Who do you get to play guitar on a Tony Rice tribute album? Who wants that job? Yeah. But anyway, I told my wife, I said, I know enough people. I've written songs with a number of them, and I know enough other guys who are great players. I think I want to do a Norman and Nancy tribute album and sort of kind of give props and give them their flowers while they're still here, as opposed to waiting, which sometimes people often do. And so, Englehart Music Group is ran by a guy named Adam Englehart, and I've known Adam for years. And Adam takes care of all the administration of my songwriting catalog. But he also has a lot of successful bluegrass acts. Tina Adair, Fast Track, and Eddie Sanders, and a whole bunch of others. So I told Adam, I said, here's my idea. I want to do a Norman Blake tribute album and have special guests come in. What do you think? He says, well, take some time, get songs together, get the artists you'd like to have on them, and bring it to me. And when I showed him everything, it was kind of a no-brainer. So that was really kind of how the whole process started, because George Gruhn decided to take out his cell phone and call Norman Blake. So that's how it started.
That's a great start to any story, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a beautiful thing, because I spoke to Chris Eldridge a couple of months ago for the podcast, and he was talking about Punch Brothers' Church Street Blues sort of tribute. Sure. And he was saying, he thought about calling Tony, because it was recorded before Tony died, and they were, but he decided that he just wanted to present it to him and say, here's this thing we made because we love you. And he never got the chance. So there's something beautiful about being able to do that for somebody who can receive the gift. It's
it really is. Thing. And of course, Chris played on one of the cuts on the album. The fitting song for Chris would have obviously is Ridge Road Gravel, because of his connection to Tony. And when I called him up, I said, hey, this is what I like to do. Would you be interested? And of course, a resounding yes. And that was one of the things. Everybody who performed on the record had to be a Norman fan. So when Chris decided, I'd love to do that with you, I called Norman. And that was the other thing with this project, is that as opposed to doing the project and then just, handing it off to Norman and Nancy saying, here's a tribute project, I took the time to develop a relationship with both of them, and then also involve him in a lot of things with song choice. What did he think about this? Letting them know how we're going to approach the tunes, even down to the artwork on the cover of the album, which is a bridge that is no longer existent. It's a bridge in Rising Fawn. And in fact, last week, I was talking to Norman, and he says, you're not going to believe this. He says, I just found out that my grandfather, his grandfather, Larkin, actually helped build that bridge. So right. It's like, how's that happen? So involving him in the process, and of course Nancy too, because I included two of her mandolin songs. It was just kind of a richer experience that way. So when it came to Chris Eldridge, I called him and said, hey, we're doing Ridge Road Gravel. The only time that's ever been cut by you is with Tony. Norman never cut it on any of his records. And I said, we don't want to make it like a Blake and Rice album. We want to make it our own thing, but we might overlap because it's Chris Eldridge and I'm doing the Norman thing. And he says this. He says, well, you guys go ahead and do it how you want. He says, but be sure on the record to dedicate it to Tony, because he was a friend of mine too. And that really touched me, So, it was nice to include Chris in that, because obviously the Blake and Rice albums, 1 and 2, they're timeless, and they will be 100 years from now for guitar players. So, yeah.
And which sort of came first, the tunes or the personnel? Did you sort of pick some tunes and then pick the people that you felt work best that way, or did you have a bunch of people you wanted to work with?
Well, part of the thing with doing any kind of album, a tribute album, with anyone who has such a huge catalog like Norman and Nancy, you're only going to scratch the surface on any project. Yeah. And so part of what the struggle was is, okay, a lot of these songs mean a lot to me because they made impressions on me early on. So it's like, how do you include the ones that are maybe obscure, like Lonesome Jenny's obscure, Widow's Creek I did with Kenny Smith, that's an instrumental, that's obscure. What's another obscure one? Hanging Dog is kind of semi-well known for Mandolin, from Nancy, but it's like, how do you include songs that are kind of a little obscure and then include things, I guess if you want to call them hits, the popular ones like Ridge Road Gravel, Ginseng Sullivan, Church Street Blues, because you have to include those as well. So I just kind of jotted down, list number 1, list number 2, and just kind of kept weeding it down and kind of going, okay, this kind of makes sense. And when it came to people, most of the time I already had in my mind who I wanted to I could hear them singing the song. And I only had a couple of scheduling conflicts, from the original list. But mostly it was like the Lonesome Jenny song. Norman's version is just him and Nancy, and it's well over 6 minutes long. I thought it would be nice to have Dale Ann Bradley bring what she does. She's a great mountain bluegrass singer and really is a great lyrical interpreter. So called her, she did that, and we put on a string section with that too, a 3-piece string section, a violin, a viola, and a cello, which normally you would never equate with Dale Ann Bradley, but it works. So a lot of it was just, I heard the singing in my head, and it just made sense. And like I said, with the exception of a couple of scheduling conflicts, I got everybody that I really wanted. I'm pretty proud of the results. So yeah. I mean, I sort of got hold of a set of the tracks yesterday and started listening, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's very intimate. It feels like being in a room with a couple of people telling you a story. It's a really sort of close sound. We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass, and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old-time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month, and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com. Yeah, that was part of the whole focus too. Is Norman and Nancy, everything they did was just either them or maybe with James Bryan for the Rising Fawn String Ensemble. Norman's mandolin record obviously had more people on it. But by and large, they produced the music in a very duo type of way. And so that was kind of important to kind of keep that whole vibe, especially when you're taking these songs And it's like, how do I approach these songs to kind of make them recognizable, but make them different, not do them like everybody else. And certainly, sometimes you're going to succeed at that. Sometimes you're going to fail in certain areas because the songs really are timeless. Like the first release, Ginseng Sullivan with Ron Block. Ron brought that arrangement to it and the chords and the way he does it. And I think what he and I did is decidedly different than what most people think Ginseng Sullivan is. And yet it still keeps, because it's just the two of us, like with every other cut on the record, it keeps the spirit of Norman and Nancy with what they did. So I think that was what made the whole project work. Keep it duo, situation. I think the only trio I've got is On and On and On with Jeremy Stevens and his wife, Karina Rose. Other than that, it's me and somebody else, whether it's instrumental or vocal. And the other thing that we did is, instead of really, browbeating arrangements to death, I just basically let people bring what they wanted to bring to the song. I mean, I had some input once we got there in the studio, but it's like, come in, this is the song you're going to do. They knew what they were going to do. So they brought the lyric in, and I basically said, okay, so what do you think? What do you got? And that's really kind of how the record came about. It's quick arrangements, quick production. There's some string noise. You can hear some finger noise, some string noise, and hear some, guitar noise. And Norman says, it's not a real record if that stuff's not in it.
I love a bit of that.
Yeah.
I love No, go ahead.
No, it's just that intimacy that the record has as a result. And it's always that forecasting thing. This record was recorded because of scheduling with people. Yeah. It was maybe 2 people a day, maybe. And it was spread out over a number of months, due to scheduling. And so there's that thing, well, at least with me, maybe, that worry if you get, 6 or 7 tunes in, then you get 10 tunes in, and so on. And it's like, what is this going to sound like when you string it all together and, put it in the right order that you want the songs? So there was a little trepidation with me on the backside of that, but I think the end result is a really intimate listening experience. And it's like you told me on the message, it's almost like being in the room. And that's a great compliment, and I actually went down and played it for Norman and Nancy, which is, that was a lesson in trying to keep you cool, but I wanted them to hear it.
Did you manage it?
Yeah. We went down after I got all the tracks done and got it mastered. And I had been telling Norman and Nancy, look, I don't want any surprises. I'd like for you to hear this, and going to their house in Rising Fawn. It's kind of like going to Oz. It's kind of like Wizard of Oz. It's like this place it's like when you pull up to the drive. Once you find the place, because they're so far away, they're so buried into the hills. Once you find it and you get in there, it's almost like time stops. And I know that sounds corny. But it really kind of does, because, now you're on their turf, And I wanted to play the record for them. And so he says, yeah, sure, come on down. And so it was me and my wife, Ginger, and we brought George Gruhn with us, too, because George and Nancy and Norman had been friends forever, since the late 60s. So I took a pair of powered studio monitors, and my phone. Ran the cables and everything and set it up in one of the rooms of the house. And then Nancy starts putting out sitting chairs, like maybe, 8 to 10 feet back from there. So I'm like, okay, this is either an audition or a firing squad. And it was Ginger and me and Norman and Nancy, George, and then Joel McCormick. Joel is a dear friend of the Blakes. He's also the judge in that county, and he's a great musician as well. He's done a lot of stuff with Norman. If you see the Songbird videos from the museum, that's Joel playing guitar. So anyway, just played the record for them, and they didn't have to, because I think they're pretty honest people. You know, what you see is what you get with them. They were really touched by the album and really appreciative and gave it high marks, which meant everything to me. You know, it's like, even if I don't sell but a few, man, you know, I got Norman and Nancy's approval on it. And so, so that was that experience. And so at least I jumped the hurdle with that. They like it, and I hope everybody else does too. You know, and they were nice enough to write liner notes for the record, which means a lot to me too. And those are two pieces of paper that I'll always cherish. Yeah.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to like this. I don't think it's going to sell just a few copies. I think it's the kind of, like, regardless of the sort of story and the intent behind it, which is a wonderful thing in its own right, but it's still got to be a good record, and it is. And it stands on either of those feet firmly, and thankfully stands on them both at the same time. I think it's really cool. And with that, you're sort of talking about the slight trepidation about sort of putting all the pieces together. How was it recorded? Was the continuity in terms of the room and the setting, or was it done in various places?
Well, again, because of scheduling conflicts and of course the pandemic, you know, that was part of the issue too. Adam Engelhardt is a studio manager of Sony Music. So, which is a world-class studio. We got a number of tracks done there, but due to the pandemic and pandemic restrictions and COVID restrictions, and then of course them doing a lot of revamping and construction, we had to record at some other places. Now, like Jensen Sullivan with Ron, I drove out to Ron's house and recorded there, which is where he does all his solo albums, and you know it's great quality. And so we did that there. We also recorded 3 or so at Ronnie Millsap's studio, Ronnie's place in Nashville. And then I recorded some at Scott Vestal, the great banjo player, Scott Vestal's studio at his house, Underground, Digital Underground. And so, you know, when you change locations, you do kind of worry about the sonic continuity, but everybody was really, I think because the record is so pared down, you know, it's not a 5-piece, everybody in the key of B bluegrass album. You know, it's more intimate. It's more in the moment, so to speak. I think the engineers, regardless of the location, were kind of more sensitive to that, you know. And of course, Adam, you know, he engineered stuff at Sony, along with his co-engineer, Tyler Pollard. And then he also did the stuff at Ronnie Millsap's studio. So he had the reins on that, you know, where he could kind of control that. But I think in the end, it all just kind of, it flows well sonically. I don't think there's any problems with that. So, and really, you know, when you work with individuals at that level, with the engineers, you just kind of learn to shut up and play guitar. You know, they've got you. They've got your back.
Yeah,
they know what to do, you know, and Adam has made enough records, and they all have, you know. So it's like, let them do what they do, and I'll just focus in on this over here. And I think that's part of the reason it sounds like it does.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely sounds great. I think one of the things I was most struck by is, I mean, the first couple of times I listened to it, different tracks jumped out, but one of the things I really enjoyed was Vince Gill singing Church Street Blues, because Church Street Blues is, you know, one of Norman's best known songs.
Sure.
But also extremely famous for Tony Rice's version of it, which is sort of, which is, you know, an incredible version of it, but it's sort of become a bit of a sort of guitar rite of passage almost, and it's become as much about the guitar as about the vocal. I mean, Tony was an incredible singer too, but it's sort of become a guitar thing, and it feels like there's a little bit of reclaiming it as a song, where it's not a particularly intricate arrangement. It's just a telling of this story of a guy who's having a hard time, feeling a bit sorry for himself, and it sort of brings it back to the song. And it's compared to Norman's version and Tony's version, it adds something as another version. It's not trying to be either of those, and I think that's quite hard to do with a song like that.
I appreciate that. And, unbeknownst to me, when Vince came in to do Church Street Blues, and it's interesting, like you said, about Tony's version and Norman's version, whether you take them on their records or even on video, sometimes there's slight inflections on the chording between Tony and Norman. Lyrically, too, there's a few things a little different between, Tony and Norman. So even in those camps, there's no one exclusive version unless you go with the very first version that Norman did. And, again, Vince was that was one of those songs and pairings. It was like, well, yeah, why not get Vince? And I had known Vince enough through other circumstances with guitar deals or whatnot that I felt comfortable in asking him to do it, which is kind of funny because I sent him a voicemail because I don't expect him to, pick up the phone, every time I would call him. He's busy. So like 2 or 3 weeks go by, and then my wife and I are out grabbing a bite to eat, and then the phone comes, Vince's number comes up, and I'm like, I got to get this, because I thought he was just not gonna. Maybe he's so busy, he doesn't have time for it. But he was so accommodating, and he's really one of those individuals that everybody's pawing at him to do something, and he's on a lot of projects, but he really does believe in adding a link to the chain, and he just loves people, and he loves the music, so, and again, Vince says, hey, I've got a way I hear this being done. I've got the lyric. I'll just show up. And he shows up with his young friend Jack Snyder, and brings out this, I think it's a 41 herringbone. And we're in the control room, and I'm just following his lead. What's the key? What's the arrangement? How does he want to play it? And he played it on the record and in the control room in a very Mother Maybelle-esque kind of way. There's no pick. He just used his fingers. And whether he realizes it or not, I think that's a nice nod back to one of Norman's influences, which is Mother Maybelle. Norman got to spend some time with her and had a relationship with her. And I think, that was a nice hearkening back. And, for me, it was like just him doing the guitar and vocal with what he did would have been enough. It's like, well, I'm just going to add something. How do you add to what's already perfect with him? And what's interesting is he recorded his guitar and vocal at the very same time. There's not any vocal fixing, no auto-tune. You don't use that with Vince Gill. And so I think that was part of the sweetness of that track, is because you're capturing it, again, very live, And so I think what we presented with Church Street Blues, and I wanted to mention this earlier before I got long-winded. When we cut that, I didn't know that the Punch Brothers were going to come out with their version, which is it's in 5, it's in 5 time. And it's, to me, I think that's a genius arrangement of that song. It really brings what they do and the timelessness of Norman's song. It kind of just cohesively blends it into something that is really Punch Brothers. Nobody else could do it like that, or would think to do it like that. Yeah. So I appreciate your compliment that, it's another version that maybe doesn't sound like every other version, So I appreciate that. But the secret to that is Vince Gill. He brought it. I just played guitar. So
you've probably been too modest there. But I think that's a really kind of an interesting point about a tribute album, is that if you've got a bunch of people who love those songs and those tunes,
yeah,
and they're all going to be musical personalities in their own right. Like,
that's right.
You have to go. Your job as an artist is to express yourself through whatever medium and whatever material you choose to use. There's no point trying. I mean, like you said about Tony, who's going to be able to play them like Norman? So, and he was unique as well. He wasn't imitating anybody else, and you've just got to keep adding to it and bring your own thing and hope that people like it. Right.
And tribute records are they're just a tricky thing at times. And what struck me, a couple of things kind of struck me funny wanting to do this project. Number one was, why hasn't anybody done a tribute to Norman before? You would think with the breadth and depth of his catalog and what him and Nancy have done, somebody would have done that by now, but that doesn't exist. And the second thing was, I've always been a bluegrass guy. I've always been a flat picker. I've always done that. But, for lack of a better phrase, my claim to fame has been playing for Tim McGraw, this iconic country artist. And so on either side of the fence, there's people that know I do one thing, but not the other, and vice versa. And it was like, to do this record, number one, I could not have done it by myself because I'm not a singer. I just am not. I can sing, but I wanted it to be great vocals, And so it was like I needed the help to bring these songs to the table. But it was like, I'm a country guy over here playing for a country artist. What's he doing the Norman Blake tribute? Well, this is that 12-year-old me. This is kind of bringing these folks to the table and calling them up. It was kind of a guilty pleasure. I kind of mentioned that in the liner notes. It's kind of indulgent. It's like, man, I want to hear what some of my favorite singers and musicians sound like doing these songs. And they just, I just happened to get to do it on my record. So, yeah, it was kind of a dream come true, a guilty indulgence, so to speak.
I think a guilty indulgence, so I'm very happy took place. I'm very much enjoying it. And it's a very interesting point, though, talking about sort of being a country player, doing the Bluegrass project. And Norman Blake is not necessarily somebody who started his career as a bluegrass musician as such. I mean, I remember you saying, I think it might have been when we talked on the phone previously about doing this interview, you sort of said Tony brought Norman into the bluegrass world. He was off playing with all sorts of people. He wasn't strictly a bluegrass player.
Right. I in one way that could be interpreted as a blanket statement in one way, but when Norman came to Nashville, he already had a reputation as a great musician in the Chattanooga area. And when he came to Nashville, which, he told me, he says, I asked him, so what guitar did you come to town with? What was your first guitar in Nashville? He says, well, I came to town with Charlie Monroe's D45. Wow. And, Norman quickly found work as a session guy. But then he hooked up with Johnny Cash. And the story there is, I forget exactly how, but Norman went with someone to a Johnny Cash recording session. I think Mother Maybelle was there, and Mother Maybelle told Cash, "This is the guitar player. This is the musician I told you about, Norman Blake." And Johnny says, "Can you play dobro?" And Norman's like, "Yeah, I play dobro." He says, "Well, get a dobro, and I'll use you on the session tomorrow." Just like that. And so Norman borrowed a dobro from Uncle Josh Graves, and that started that relationship. And then, of course, he went on as the band leader and musical director as far as Johnny Cash's band's concerned, with the Cash Show TV show, And I had, if you get the box set of the DVDs, you see a lot of Norman on there as well. So he started with that, and he also worked for Chris Christopherson for a while. Did the Isle of Wight Festival with Christopherson, and then so he had those roots, and of course, Bob Dylan's Nashville Skyline album. He played on that also. But then he made this departure and started to fully develop, becoming Norman Blake as we know him, And so we've talked about what it was like to be a side guy, And so to be a side guy, like with what I do, I don't want to say regimented, but, I know my lane of traffic. This is what I do, And I think that develops certain disciplines to bring to the table in a lot of different ways, musically, personality-wise, how to get along with people, how to travel, how to stay out of people's hair, so to speak, and then, of course, how to work as a band, as a group, know what you need to do. And I would say that I brought some of those things, obviously, to the project. But, being a side guy for that long with the country artists here in town, that's paid the mortgage, that's helped raise a family. But again, just under that surface has always been this music that I really love. And I was telling someone that I found it recently that it's like I just turned 56, and it's like the older you get, if you're raised in that music, and you may take other detours, it's like you always find yourself kind of coming back to this, I don't know, safe zone. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but I guess it gets so ingrained in you when you're young, and then you go out into the world and do what you're going to do, and then you just kind of follow your way back to it, So, yeah, that's like where I'm at with all that.
Yeah, it's a bit like being from the country, moving to the city for a while, but moving back to sort of settle down and raise a family. It's like, there's a homecoming element about something that's that deeply ingrained in you. Yeah, I think, those songs, and plus, those songs that Norman wrote, they're snapshots of his childhood and growing up. And I was also raised in a rural environment. So, I guess there's that too. I relate to him in my own way with growing up in a rural environment. So, yeah. And that whole sort of thing about playing with other people and as a sideman. I mean, my first knowledge of Norman was when he played on Steve Earle's Train a Comin' album. And I was a big Steve Earle fan. Steve had, been to prison and come out, and this was his first album back. And I didn't know anything about bluegrass at that point in my life. And I'm sort of listening to this, and there's one track, I think it's called Northern Winds, which is just Norman playing the guitar. I mean, the liner notes just said, "Shut up and learn something," or "Shut up and listen," or something like that. And then realised it's the same guy who's also playing the dobro on the record, and just think, this, and then went to see Steve Earle play live, and he said, we didn't tour that record because Norman didn't want to fly. I'm thinking, I need to find out more about this guy, and here we are now. I'm by no means an expert in Norman Blake, but I'm learning to love his music.
And that's the other thing that I kind of wanted to make this record for. The 3 points that I always kind of make with this is, number one, this record is kind of the thank you from the 12-year-old me in a certain regard. And next, it's for the folks that are really familiar with Norman's music and maybe have been listening to him for maybe 5 years or maybe 45 years. And they remember the first time they saw him in concert or bought the vinyl, because a lot of his stuff is not, some of the early stuff is not on CD. I mean, I'm sure it probably is by now, but I'm saying some of the stuff you just have to dig out in vinyl, and so a lot of younger people may not be familiar with it. And that's really the third point of that. Younger musicians may not really know stuff off his Old and New album or Home in Sulphur Springs or Fields of November. but they may know Ronnie Bowman. They might be a fan of Vince or Trey Hensley or Mike Compton or whoever on the record, and they'll listen to our cuts and go, man, I really like that performance by so-and-so. And I hope they get inspired and go, hey, I want to go find the original versions of this. And begging the point with Tony, we never, didn't cover that. Tony bringing Norman into bluegrass. When I said that, what I meant was Norman, you can't really classify what he does as it's not bluegrass. It's, and I think even to kind of slip into the titles of Americana or folk, I think in a way that's kind of misleading in a way. I think what he and Nancy did, that's them. It's Norman and Nancy Blake music. And I think the closest that you could get to that today, maybe in modern terms, is maybe Dave Rawlings and Gillian Welch.
Yeah.
And as far as defining something very unique, because certainly what they do is very unique. But, when Tony started cutting Norman songs, that brought those things into, I think, a wider spectrum and a different interpretation. Certainly bluegrass guitar players were already aware of Norman Blake's guitar playing in music, yes. But I think Tony brought it into a broader field, if that makes sense. That maybe would have not have been there had he not cut those songs. So, and what's funny is, those songs were cut. Even if you go to Blake and Rice, which are like 1987 and 1990, that's a while ago,
Yeah.
And you think, 1990, that's that's not exactly yesterday, So there's some years between what we kind of consider the definitive versions. So I think Tony brought him in to perhaps a wider bluegrass audience. But then again, people who play bluegrass guitar and flat picking guitar, they already had Norman on their map. So.
And the sort of the wider sort of understanding and awareness of bluegrass is maybe different now than it was in the late 80s, early 90s. Like just, my generation lived through the Oh Brother, Where Art Thou thing, which, came at the same sort of time as, Alison Krauss and Nickel Creek. And there was suddenly a lot of people aware of, and so that probably, I presume there was a whole resurgence in awareness of Norman's stuff then as well. And there's suddenly a bigger audience for this stuff.
Sure. And, I think the appeal, certainly what we consider bluegrass, and it's always been this way. It's always morphing. It's always kind of changing. You have your strict traditionalists. You have your contemporary. You have, early on you had Newgrass Revival doing things that were kind of blasphemous to the traditionalist. But that drew in, for the good. It drew in a younger audience that maybe remembers Mac Wiseman or Flatt and Scruggs with their mom and dad, but they're like, man, look at these hippies. They're playing the same. They're playing a banjo, they're playing a mandolin, but it's different. And that's just what it's always been. But I think what really, really helped bluegrass overall was that the technology end of it with YouTube and streaming music. I think as far as media access and being able to share the music, that resonated with a younger type of musician. And also, those younger musicians like a Chris Thiele or maybe a Molly Tuttle or a Billy Strings, they're not just bluegrass. They're bringing in influences from other genres that they enjoy listening to, whatever that might be. And they're adding that to that. And, we didn't really get that early on in the formative years of bluegrass, maybe as much as that. So it's always changing. It's always morphing. And same way with guitar styles in that genre. People want to, they might make certain criticisms about certain players. Traditionalists may not like what Billy Strings does, but I'm like, well, Billy Strings is bringing it to a wider audience than, that's been brought to in a long time. He's doing something that other facets of bluegrass either couldn't do or wouldn't do. So, and same way with Molly, and yet Billy Strings can sit down with you and just, tear Doc Watson up, verbatim. So it isn't like he's displaced from it. He's just bringing what he does. So I think that has its own value, and the musicianship, that's the other thing, is just how good and how high the level of musicianship in the past, 15 years, 20 years with musicians. There's so many younger musicians coming to the table, bringing skills that, when I was a teenager in the late 70s, early 80s, nobody was playing like that. You had Mark O'Connor, who came out with his guitar album, Arcology, and we're like, just totally freaked out that he's doing that. That's as tough as it got. And now that's commonplace. There's so many great players out there, whether Trey Hensley or Aubrey King or Jake Workman or Molly or Billy. There's so many great players out there. And so, yeah, I don't think there's going to be any slowdown of that either. And the other great thing is that they're so connected to the past, a lot of them. They can tell you about Flatt and Scruggs or Jimmy Martin or whatever. And so, yeah, the future's bright for sure for guitar.
And I think that technology point is really interesting because it works on so many levels. Just the streaming thing. When I was getting into bluegrass originally in the sort of late 90s and just trying to find guides of what I should be listening to and what I should be buying. And,
Right.
To buy a bluegrass CD in London in the UK in the 90s, you'd have to buy an imported version of something that cost you an arm and a leg. You'd never heard it. You didn't know if you were going to like it. You didn't know, and it's like, it was a big risk to fork out that amount. And now you can turn your phone on and go like Flatt and Scruggs. Okay, let's have a look. And it makes stuff accessible. But I think there's also that thing of learning an instrument. You don't have to keep putting the needle down again and again to work out what somebody's doing. Stuff's on YouTube, or you can go to a site like Artist Works and learn from Brian Sutton or Tony Trischka or Mike Marshall or the people who are in the thick of it.
Yeah.
And so and on top of that, the technology of just instrument making, obviously there's a huge love for vintage instruments, but the basic level of affordable new instruments now is so much better than it was when I was a kid. You can learn to play guitar without it physically injuring you.
Growing up in the that late 70s, early 80s period for myself. I graduated high school in 84. And yeah, it really was just a matter of dropping the needle and trying to capture what they're doing, which I think in one way, because it was non-visual, I think in an auditory sense, you had to learn, it developed your ear in a particular way of listening because you couldn't see what they were doing, but you could hear it. So you had to learn through just hearing, how are they getting that chord or how are they doing that phrase or whatnot. And today, because of YouTube and others, or AutoSworks, or even early on, there we go in the 80s, the early homespun tapes, video, you could now order a VHS tape, put that in, and now you can see how they're doing that. In my day and time, early on, that was just non-existent. And so I think younger players being able to see, or anybody really though, being able to watch how it's actually done and played, and just the sheer number. The technology is really great. And of course, being at my age, I will say, yeah, it's kind of cool just to put a record on and learn that way. Just learn by listening. There's something to that as well. But yeah, and with instruments too. In my day, I sound like I'm not that old, but yeah, in the early '80s, I was the kid that was bringing the Frets magazine. I guess you guys had that over there in UK. Frets, and then Pickin' magazine. I was bringing those to school, and really, you had Martin, but also you had Gallagher, and then you had Mossman. That was a big, Stuart Mossman guitars, and yeah, you had some others that were making guitars, but again, unless they advertised in one of those trade publications, you didn't know. You just didn't know about them. And today, man, there's just so many great makers. Whether it's a large entity like a Martin, or still a good size hands-on shop like Collins. I play Collins guitars.
Yeah.
And I've been to that shop. It's bigger than you think, but it's still very hands-on. On down to the guy who's maybe making 10 instruments a year in his basement, And for luthiers, just the knowledge to be shared. They can call up a TJ Thompson or a Mark Stutman, or a Dave Musselwhite and say, how do I do this? And that community is very sharing and very giving. So it seems like the bar is raised overall, whether it's musicianship, the material, the influences, or for builders as well. And for this project, we kind of wanted to keep in the vintage world. I used a Collins CJ45, but man, it was kind of fun also watching everybody bring in their old pieces of wood. Yeah. So that was fun to make an album that was, because Norman has just been, Norman Blake and vintage guitars are synonymous with each other, So yeah, and everybody brought their good stuff. So yeah.
And did George Gruhn have a sort of a hand in that as well, in terms of which instruments were? Was he available to advise and have opinions? Because I imagine he'd be fascinated to see what was coming in and out of those rooms.
Well, like Tim Stafford, he brought his 34 D18. Kenny Smith brought his 35 D18. I've got Frankie, my 36 D18. Critter brought his 37. So, and everybody else brought what they brought. George, I don't know why, but he really gave me kind of carte blanche with instruments. He told me, he says you can use anything I have in the collection, and I'm like, wow, okay, appreciate it. And so I had cut some stuff with certain guitars, but listening back, they maybe didn't appeal on track as much after I listened to them. So I went back. I did 2 overdubs. I went back in and I used a 31 L2 from George, and then I used I think it was a 37 or 38 Advanced Jumbo, Gibson Advanced Jumbo. Other than that, I had the CJ45 from Collins. Other than that, it's Frankie, my D18, which is kind of like, that was always the bucket list guitar. And again, because of Norman Blake, his Whiskey Before Breakfast album, on the cover of the album, that's a 36 D18, but on the record, it's a 34 D18 bar fret. And so, I guess I always kind of make the joke, when I bought that record and started playing it, I was wondering, why doesn't my cheap Bentley guitar sound like that? And I say, it just took me 40-something years to get the right guitar, So, yeah. But everybody brought really great instruments. and I think that added to the sonic quality. You can listen to this project and really hear the wood and the expression of those vintage instruments. So yeah.
Yeah, and the sort of duo setting really lets that breathe and lets that live, and you can hear everything. I love hearing
Sure.
acoustic duo records because there's just you hear more of the instruments, and there's a sense of conversation going on as well, and there's something very intimate and just really appealing about that.
Yeah, and that's some of my favorite records. Whether it's the Blake or Rice albums, those are really great. Tony's Church Street Blues album will always be timeless. The tone will always be something people are trying to capture. And in the modern world, all the stuff that Julian Lage and Chris Eldridge have done. I love those records.
I love those. Fantastic.
Yeah, that's great. Even though it's not bluegrass or anything, one of my favorite records, and I would say it's one of my favorite records ever, and it probably will be 20 years from now if I live that long, is Julian Lage's World's Fair album. Because when you put headphones on and play that, the sound of that guitar, the way it's recorded, and I think also that maybe hopefully was part of the appeal I was trying to convey with this record. There's enough records out there with bands and a lot of music, a lot of sound, a lot of things going on. And those are great, and they have their place as well, because that's what music is all about. But it's nice to contribute an album like this where, like you said, it's kind of conversational, and it's a little slower. It's a little slower pace, a little bit more living room, if you want to put it like that, like we sound like we're in the living room. And I hope this is a record that people enjoy. They can put it on, and hopefully not hard to listen to, And yet, by not being hard to listen to, it translates in a way where they can garner a lot from it. Yeah, so I'm really proud of it.
Yeah, and you should be. It feels sort of it feels timeless already. It's got there's just a depth to the songs and the performances, and it feels. Maybe I'm biased by knowing the story behind it before I heard it, but it just feels like there's a lot of love in it. It feels like an album full of love and respect and like joy.
Yeah, I think so. I think that was the thing that everybody brought intrinsically to the project. Norman turns 84 on March 10th, which is when the record actually releases. The full record. Right now, when we're talking, it's available for pre-order, and the first single, Jensen Sullivan, just came out a couple days ago. But he turns 84 years old and still plays. He's and I don't think he would be offended me saying this, because this is something that technology has brought too. When we punch in Tony Rice or Norman Blake or anybody that we love musically into YouTube for videos, we have a mindset that they're always that age.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing. And I guess that part of that is too with what gets lodged into your psyche when you're younger musically. You always remember them when you hear them at that age and all the experiences around you being a certain age when you first heard them. Mm-hmm. And so, he's turning 84. He's not the fiery picking Norman Blake from Whiskey Before Breakfast or the Blake and Rice. He's not that. But he is this richer, deeper musician, and I've sat there and fortunate enough to sit with him and play, or just sit there. I tell you what, the first time I went down, I really wasn't worried about playing with him. It was more about visiting. It was more about meeting him, getting to visit with him and Nancy, and then playing the music, playing the record for him.
Mm.
But afterwards, he took me upstairs, and we played some. But that's my dogs. But we ended up playing banjo. No guitar, no mandolin, no nothing, just banjo. And he has this great collection of old banjos, from open back banjos, various brands, from the 1910s through 1920s. Has them strung with nylon strings because that's what he prefers. And I was playing some banjo with him. And I just got to the point where I quit playing and just watched his right hand, because he still has that right hand. It's like, I want that right hand. If I could get that right, and so I think as musicians age, one of the values that I gained from this experience with him is that in a world where everybody is so consumed with maybe playing fast, or putting on the metronome at 150 beats and doing what they do for a minute for an Instagram video or whatever. I think the one thing I take away, which is nothing wrong with it, if you can do it, great, but there's going to be a point in your life that those skills are going to go just because of age. You're going to lose those things. And what I've kind of learned a little from Norman is it's okay to get old. It's okay to be an old guitar player. And it's okay to change and morph and develop your skills to fit your age. And I think if you have a focus as a player to develop those things early on, whether that's in your late 20s or your 30s or 40s or 50s or whatever, to develop a certain toolbox of skills and musical sensibility, that when those things do start to fade and your hands don't work like they used to, and you just by necessity you have to change, if you've developed those things and have that musical depth, then whatever you do age appropriately, it's still going to be you. It's still going to be great. And I think at the end of the day, you're being honest with yourself. Tony, unfortunately, Tony didn't live long enough. And I think because of his hands and his arthritis and stuff, he just kind of quit playing. He just didn't do that for the longest time. And I think I respect that, because from Tony's perspective, he just decided to go out on top. I'm not going to give people subpar for performances. Consequently, Norman Blake is still making records. I mean, last time I was down there talking to him, he's talking about making another record. Day by Day just came out last year.
Yeah.
He's talking about making another record. So he's not letting his age or the way he plays slow him down. And I think if you can look past the playing, which is still great, but if you can look past that and look at how he got there and what he's doing and how he's doing it, that's something as a musician you can take with you and build on, for your whole life, And so I think I've learned a lot more about other things other than playing music through this whole experience with making this record. It's kind of changed certain things in my life and my perspective, that it's okay to get old. It's okay not to be able to play certain things the way you used to. It's going to happen eventually anyway. Embrace those changes as a musician. And, maybe that's why older musicians, I grew up listening to older musicians say, well, it's about tone. It's about your tone. It's about the taste, the space between the notes. And I think now I kind of get that, more than ever, because it is about pulling tone, and it is about note choice. It is about creating space in the music, which are exactly the things maybe as a younger player, you're kind of like, man, how are they doing that? That's the thing you like about certain music. Well, the reason you like it is because the people that are doing it are old enough to realize that's the perspective. That's what really matters. So, yeah, that's some rambling, but I think that's kind of where I'm getting to.
Yeah, and I think that's true of life, isn't it? It's you've got music is communication. Like if you're playing music for real, right, you are trying to communicate something of what it is to be you to other people and form some kind of connection. And so you've got to have something to say. And maybe when you're younger, you have a bit less to say and a bit more invested in how you say it. And as you get older, you invest a bit more in what it is you're saying. And that's sort of true through life, isn't it? You get to know yourself. Some people come out 21 years old, know exactly who they are. Whether Miles Davis left space from day one. But that's you learn yourself as a human, and as well as you sort of in parallel with learning who you are as a musician. They're not separate things, are they?
I don't think they are, and I think as you get older, I've got Ginger and I have 2 grandchildren now, 5 years old, and one that just turned 1, and that's a perspective change, And now, I'll play guitar around the house or whatnot when they're here. It's kind of funny. I did the Grand Ole Opry with Wendy Moten, who's a great singer, just a great singer. I did that with her a couple nights ago, and I was playing the video. We have a large TV, and I was casting it from my phone to the TV. And my 5-year-old grandson, that was his first thing of what I do for a living. He saw Pawpaw up on the screen, playing guitar, as opposed to playing in the house. And so my perspective isn't really, my perspective is investing the music into them now, and I hope with my vinyl collection and my CDs and all the instruments, it's I want to take this music and pass it on to them. And so that's where I'm investing, and you slow down, I will say this for traveling, as a traveling musician, traveling gets tough as you get older, packing a bag and fighting at an airport and getting to the hotel and all that. Especially if you go overseas, a few years ago, we did England, Scotland and Ireland, and we've been to Australia. It takes forever to get to Australia. Yeah. And that's a lot of time in the air, and you're not going for just one day. You're there for 2 weeks, And so, but the older you get, the travel gets tougher. And the shows become the easy part. It's all the other stuff. So when I come home, it's, it's pick up an old guitar and play stuff that I really enjoy playing, visit with the grandkids. And that your perspective changes as you get older. And I think that's with everybody. And when my time comes to not make a living playing music anymore, it's I always want to play music, but I'd like to get into something I know it sounds crazy, but learning how to do, make, Japanese woodworking with cutting Japanese wood joints, or something in a shop like that, I think your focus changes, and then with learning how to play age appropriate. I don't know why I keep saying that, but that's really just kind of become a thing with me. It's just be happy. I think the technology age has put us in a position where maybe we think we have to perform too much for our peers, and maybe sometimes we do things on video with our playing for the wrong reasons, maybe. Is that a weird perspective?
No,
maybe we're trying to impress. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the first interviews I did for this podcast, I think the first interview was Jake Eddy, who plays with Becky Buller's band. And he was saying that sort of, 180 BPM for Instagram. He's saying that's just marketing. You're just sort of showing people you can do it. He said, you come to one of my shows, I'm not going above 120. I'm often playing slower than that. He said it's sort of part of marketing yourself as a thing online. He said it's not real. And it's exciting. It's exciting to listen to, but I get as much joy out of listening to Eric Sky give a tune a huge amount of air and breath, and that there's infinitely as much, if not more, to be enjoyed about that. Man,
I've known Eric for years, and when I go up to his neck of the woods, we always hook up and play. And man, I always learn something from him. The space and tone that he pulls, and his interpretation. You can get a lot from that. And the marketing aspect of it, maybe I see that. I don't know. It's just I think learning to put different tools in the toolbox. So if you do live to be 84 like Norman Blake, you still have something really kind of profound to say. But in the end, this album has just been a pleasure to make, and it's really changed my way of thinking with a lot of things, not only with life in general, but also with how to make a record, how to listen to people play. When you sit in a room with any of these folks here, you kind of have to go. I wanted to go in as part producer, part student, because I knew I would learn something from the way they did things. So this record, it's been a pleasure to make, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. I really do. And I hope everybody else really takes a listen to it, and I hope it finds a place on their repeated playlist. How's that?
Yeah, I'm enjoying it already, and I can imagine that's only going to deepen the more I listen to it. So thank you for making it, and thanks for taking the time out to come and chat to me. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, Matt, again, your podcast is one of the great ones out there, and you're helping so many players in so many different ways. And I appreciate you having me and letting me ramble in my typical mid-Tennessee way. And I appreciate your time, and I look forward to more of your podcasts down the line, my friend. Thank you so much.
Cool. That was a lot of fun to record. I will stick some info in the show notes so you can see where you need to go to find out more about the record and to order a copy for yourself, which I highly recommend you do. Thanks again to Bob. That was great. I will see you all next time. Happy picking. Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.